Sean, welcome to the pod.
Thanks for having me.
First, before we talk about the excellent photojournal that you've produced during lockdown, I wonder if you could maybe give the listeners just a bit sense of your own personal background and how we got to here.
Aye, so I am a trade union organiser and community campaigner. I'm based in Glasgow. I have, I suppose, a history of community organising through various left-wing and working class projects. Most recently, I suppose, was Living Rent, involved in a community land occupation on the site of public land that's been sold for private housing at the minute. And I've been organising mainly public sector workers for the last 18 months, right through COVID.
And tell me, I mean, the photojournal itself, I mean, it's a great idea. As soon as I seen it was advertised online, I ordered a copy because I think it's one of these things that's like with COVID and lockdown, there's a whole lot of stuff, quite something that's really interesting, creative stuff going on. But I'm always fascinated by sort of working class responses and creative responses that come through the community. So the lockdown journal, the photojournal definitely fits into that category. So maybe tell me a little bit about how you came up with that idea.
Aye, so excuse me. The idea, I suppose, is it draws from what I was always taught, something called so you've got a workers' inquiry, but a neighbourhood inquiry. So if you're mapping a workplace to see what workers could be involved in a union or what campaigns and issues, similar aspect could be done in the community or neighbourhood. And it was a housing academic taught me, Neil Gray, and so forever organising in community events or even areas you've grew up in for a long time and you've noticed it change. It was always thought to be a good thing to do. So just basically walking around an area and seeing what's changing, but also seeing what businesses are in the area, what social and cultural institutions are there, or what other kind of civic organisations, but also working class organisations are there, what's was there that's not in anymore, or what's been removed and what's coming in. So during lockdown, it was also a perfect opportunity at a personal level to escape being locked in the flat, COVID, host other pressures and anxiety and fears of building down in all of us, I think, when we're stuck in the house. So I wanted to get out. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I look at, bought a disposable camera and just went to walk the local area. And I think that's really when we can, for me personally, during that process, you're locked in and your only escape is your local area. So I think you notice things a wee bit more or notice how things are changing. And then how your lived environment also affects you. You know what I mean? Being locked in the house. So like, what are the changes to your lived area, your local environment, the impacts? Also, how's it changing? Is it for better or worse? And what's making those differences? You know what I mean? Is public housing getting flattened? As a lot of private development coming in, is that changing nature and the demographic, the class composition of your local area? And does that have an impact on your ability, your economic situation, or the schools your kids can go to, or a whole host of other things? Is it our businesses leaving? I know, so we can talk about deindustrialisation. It's every 40 years on, we're still not recovered from it. But things like that. And are these deindustrialised areas, brownfield sites, still lying vacant? Why are they lying vacant? Who owns them? So you start to get into things about who owns the land, why is there a shortage of housing, and how can we not, as a class, really kind of get ahead or make a plant a flag, I suppose, and actually do it. To understand all that, to understand what we need to do, I suppose it's a good idea for me was just taking pictures of them and seeing what it was like. What was their current lived environment? So try to escape the house, but you're escaping into an area where I think in many areas of Glasgow has been in decline, and how, I suppose, is the council and the communities fighting that battle to improve it, and whose interests are they trying to improve it? So what started as maybe quite an innocent thing to get out of the house, clear my head. It made me understand how the city's changing around working class neighbourhoods, and then with the journal, what I did was I've been looking back each month and going through the quotes for senior politicians and just highlighting maybe some of the more absurd things they said a year ago and marrying it up with the pictures to show the kind of disconnect that can happen from a political class with the lived experience on the ground, and having that contrast. I don't have to write probably not capable of writing a big critical theoretical analysis, but just even that pictures, a quote, and the contrast tells its own story quite powerfully, I felt. And I think the feedback I've got so far, others do too. So the idea of just doing that at a personal level, but it's something that I've spoke to others and let's encourage everybody to do it, basically. You know what I mean?
It's fascinating to hear you describe it, because you're right. I mean, sensei, how places are changing, working class communities are changing. But one of the things they locked down was even the community I live in, or the communities that I was doing some work in, you notice the difference in them because they were a lot quieter. There seemed to be a lot less people about, but also a lot of the people who would work there, whether it's businesses were closed or whether it's the charities or whatever were closed, or community centres closed. So whatever it was, they were all. It was very much even more a sort of social desert than it normally is, and sometimes all these places are like that anyway. But cataloguing it in photographs is a really, really important visual way of keeping that record. Then obviously, as you say, you chose to do that in terms of months. So could you maybe say a little bit about that? Because I think that works really well as well. You take the quotes for the politicians of that month, but you're showing the pictures that you're taking of that month. Now, obviously, we didn't know where it's going to go, but we're now talking about over a year ago. But maybe just talk us through that idea of doing it month by month.
I suppose that wasn't a predetermined thing. I wish I could come up with something that kind of really blew your mind in that regard, but it was just, and the pictures maybe don't overlap exactly, just in terms of the time I managed to get out. But it was just, I think, the good idea to break it down into something that was the whole idea that the kind of wee magazine as well was for it to be accessible, I suppose, and it was easy to read, but also when you're a kid, you read a comic or a magazine, you know what I mean? You could absorb it quite quickly, but also not putting that in. I've thought about it again recently. It's like, should I have put it in the one volume? You know what I mean? And chatted the full year under lockdown. But I think there's too much information sometimes to really absorb that whole change, that whole process, and what has changed across a year. So having that kind of monthly instalment has been really useful for me, just to actually see and try and line it up with where we're at this year. So like the next issue I'm going to do is May, and May's the month. So we're seeing what they said last year in May before we see what happens this year in May again, so we can reflect. So like some of the quotes for Sturgeon and Johnson are talking about right, a lockdown in 3 weeks. Remember a year later, you know what I mean, and stuff like that. So it's been useful, but also what I've tried to do at the end of each volume is using the World Health Organization statistics, break down the number of cases, deaths by UK, Europe, and across the world, and having that at the end of each volume to chart how the impact the virus had in terms of those statistics is quite an eye-opener, coupled with the quotes from politicians. Like I said, I just sent May's into the printers this week, and there's a huge jump between April and May last year that I never clocked. You know what I mean? In terms of the number of cases, also the number of deaths. And this month, going into April and May, we're looking at hopefully lockdown restrictions lifting a bit more and the vaccine level. But it was like having that month by month, the ability to just kind of break it down and assess it and take it and absorb it fully month by month is helpful, rather than just being a big chronological, everything crammed out the one volume and you can flick through it and discard it. I suppose you've got a chance to kind of absorb the trajectory as to how it went last year.
I think it works really well month by month, and I was sort of struck and you're a bit taken aback when you look at the quotes. I mean, you mentioned the sort of disconnect between the sort of the quotes of senior politicians and the images that you're putting, and it's brilliant because there's no any commentary where it works really well, just their words and then the images of how things are actually looking on the ground. And that disconnect between what politicians say in the media or stand up and announce at a podium and what's actually happening on the ground it's really stark to see them placed like that. And of course, then a year on, you're reflecting back on the fact that, you know, what they were saying. I mean, it'll be quite interesting to see, because a lot of times when I hear them saying things, I think, my God, I'm sure they said that a year ago. Like, I mean, so it'll be really interesting to see that as well, because a lot of the times what we're saying is quite vacuous. I mean, they're really, when you read the statements, and obviously they're quotes taken like out of a larger speech, fair play, but they still, when you listen to what they're actually saying, it's quite vacuous and empty, and they will be able just to regurgitate that time and time again. So to see it catalogued in that way is, I think, really, really interesting. And did you choose to do that on purpose?
Aye, on one level, it's more manageable, I suppose, for me. You know what I mean? It was a kind of side project, and it was more manageable. But I think, like you said, just even having that reference point, easy enough month by month, and it was a predetermined thing, I suppose, in some ways, because it was So you can have got a friend who is buying them, and he says, I'm going to collect them because it's and give it to my niece and my nephew. Because they'll learn about this in school, and it's easy to read and have that absorbed and see what's going on. Plus, like you said, when you've got these quotes and you're sure you've heard them say it before, you can then easily look back and say, you said that exactly a year ago. Plus, there are certain milestones that you maybe remember month by month during the last year. There'll be reference points, so it's easy to find it. And then we've got this election coming up, so it'll be interesting to see what they said this time last year and how it marries up with what they're saying in an election period. You know what I mean?
And of course, that's the other interesting thing that I noticed for the volume that I was looking at was that these are all working class communities, and I think most of the photos, I think there's only one where there's sort of a person in the background, but most of them didn't have people in them. And again, was that a sort of choice that you made deliberately to have the area just bare so as people can then think about that a bit?
It was in some ways, and it was also just me being a bit scared to ask people to get their picture. But it also reflects, I think, what you said at the start of the podcast, where for a number of reasons, the communities did seem more of a desert, particularly working class areas. You know what I mean? We don't have the shops or the social infrastructure to congregate, even if we could, but we don't have the outdoor leisure facilities or to do your physical exercise. You know what I mean? And what our street furniture is completely different in working class areas than it is in more affluent areas for various reasons, but they're also scared of it. So was one, I was looking back through some pictures yesterday, and I found this picture in an estate just up the road, and it's 4 kind of mini blocks of flats. In between each one's a big CCTV tower. And I never noticed at the time. I took the picture looking because you see the camp trees in the background. I walked up the street yesterday and I noticed the CCTV. And again, it's that lived infrastructure. So it was conscious in a lot of ways because the streets were empty. But I felt during that time I was because I was wanting to escape, I was maybe wanting an escape for isolation, but wanted to feel and clear my head my own thoughts. And I think my eyes were drawn to stuff that was increasingly quite, that reflected that kind of whole atmosphere of isolation. Everybody felt isolated or alone or siphoned off and lonely. You know what I mean? And I think you can discuss and go into like how alienation, but I felt as if, and it came out more and more as I was taking the pictures and more of doing this, it's like a lot of these areas feel haunted by various things. It could be haunted by maybe an industrial past or the vibrancy of a community before, or even the good and the bad things that happened in that area. But a lot of these, I was drawn to places that felt haunted, that something was there that's not there anymore, if that makes sense. And I think that's why there's a lack of people in it. But also because I had a lack of people outside. Everybody was, and like a lot of people that are doing stuff have been drawn into city centres because that's where people used to be. And that's where the big contrast is. During lockdown, everybody was in the city centres, shopping, pubs, nightclubs. You go in now, any city in the UK for a long time, a lot of pubs, nightclubs, shops were all bolted up, and it was striking visually. But the same thing was happening in our communities, and I don't know if that's something that was pre-existing. I could I guess that it was in a lot of ways, but it was the first time it really was drawn to my attention, and I started to think about why that was happening. You know what I mean? And because you couldn't go into the city centre or leave the local area, you start again noticing the impact different political choices have had in your area and how it does feel. Because if you maybe in my line of work, I've managed to get out and about a lot more. I've not noticed it the last few years. But if you are not travelling for work or you've not got the disposable cash to go into the city centre, that's your reality day to day. What kind of impact does that have in your mental health or your aspirations or you're feeling that loneliness and alienation? So it kind of opened my mind, gave me a refresher. And that again, I suppose, when a time when you were young, growing up in the States, and you never left your scheme for various reasons. I mean, I felt a lot like that again. So it was a real journey to kind of to start putting myself back in that mindset. And that kind of led to the community occupation that we've got up the road with the land. There was a lot of people that were involved in the local tenants union. And we noticed that a sign went up saying the land was sale. We noticed that because we were out walking our local area more. You know what I mean? And we went, well, what is happening with this land? And as soon as you scratched the surface, a whole host of stuff came out that kind of lead you down a path to big structural issues around housing and the economy. But at a fundamental level, this is public land in a public area being sold for private development that's lay vacant for 14 years that used to have public housing. And why are they not buying public housing again? What kind of housing? Who's it for? Whole host of stuff. And then from that, we've occupied the land, I suppose, and it's a kind of grandiose way of saying it. We've put a hut on top of it and built a community garden and getting people out and about. But we've managed to pause the sale of the land. But that happened out of people walking in a local area and questioning and thinking about what's happening around about us and why is that happening and kind of what can we do about it. Which I think is, this isn't just the lockdown journal, it's not just a kind of arty magazine. As I suppose as an inquiry is the way I looked at the start, is what is happening, why is it happening, and then what can we do after it. So it's an organising tool as much as anything else, I think.
No, that's a good way of looking at it and thinking about it in the sense, and it leads on to collective action, like the occupation of the land that you're describing as well. One of the other things I thought when I was struck when I looked at, because it is images of working class communities and the quotes of the politicians, and then you see at the end the statistics, which are horrific. But it very much chimed with my experience as well in working class communities, that there was that sort of haunted feeling that you're talking about. Places were really quiet, but also people were afraid. People were a bit concerned about their health because of the pandemic, but about their future and about cuts that were coming, about cuts that had been, about all about housing rights, employment rights. People were really terrified. And then you would also get watching news at night, and there would be some, happy clappy story about, there's this group of people doing some yoga in their back garden or something. That's like wonderful. And I'm not being, like dismissive of people who managed to do something like that, but in working class communities, a lot of the time, people were really, really scared. And if you were cooped up in flats, the experience of people being cooped up in flats, where maybe they didn't have that good family support network around about them, or they didn't have that support from neighbours who sometimes didn't speak English or didn't know their neighbours, didn't get on with their neighbours, it wasn't the same for everybody. So it was all people, politicians, just spend some time in your garden during the furlough or something. You know what I mean? That wasn't everyone's experience. And the journal, I think we get a real sense of that actually the lived experience of the pandemic was totally different depending on your social class and whereabout in the cities you were living and what support you could access. And was that deliberate? Because I think it is quite interesting that it is images of working class communities, because it would have been easy to say, let's contrast it with this or contrast it with that, but you've chose not to do that. Like.
Aye, and I think, again, I'd like to see it was a kind of predetermined decision, and it wasn't, but it was a conscious decision to go to areas maybe where I felt more comfortable, or that wasn't being represented. Something like, so if you're stuck in the house, like you said, the news was showing you areas where people were having nice socially distant street parties and nice wee cul-de-sacs with front and back doors and gardens with wee white picket fences. And it was almost the news and TV, but it became another TV show. It became almost fiction. So I felt alienated watching the TV. That wasn't the life I stayed in a tower block. It wasn't. I wasn't seeing my community representing TV. Wasn't that disconnect? So I think, again, I was drawn to these areas for one way or another, and it wasn't drawn to a kind of sadistic, or I wanted to go and run about the working class areas. I went for, I don't know why I went, but I went to actually just feel something normal in my what I felt was normal, and document that and actually see and just feel that. Because I remember walking away years ago, and I was walking abroad, and every day I come back, I was like, why did you come back? And I can always, in my mind, I can always remember the lockups that my mum and dad's were. And for some reason, I was always drawn to come back to these grey, stinking, paint flaking off lockups. But it was maybe something like that I needed. The anxiety I felt and the isolation I felt, I needed, that was my nostalgia that I needed. I needed to feel that again. I needed to absorb myself into a wee bit, to just relax almost. You know what I mean? That sounds really strange. I think not having that representation through the TV, when you're getting bombarded with stuff and you've got all these fears, you're stuck inside. I think you mentioned that a guy I worked with spoke, said he listened to a podcast, I don't know what one it was, but he said people are stuck inside with their own thoughts, forced to face their own life decisions. And you can descend into that cycle of fear and anxiety, and we've not got that structure, that family unit or whatever around about you. Where do you feel that and I think it's don't quote me on it, but like a therapeutic thing. When you are in that, you look for things that are nostalgic. You look for the security and stuff that you remember from childhood, maybe. You know what I mean? And you look for that. And I think I went looking for that. And in the process of looking for that, I noticed that that might not exist for a lot of people also. You know what I mean? So if we look at the changes that are happening in working class areas, particularly in the big cities in Scotland, if you grew up in Glasgow or Edinburgh, or the inner city schemes of these cities, moved away or you moved it to suburbs and you were hit lockdown and you had this paranoia or fear, if you were even just anyone living away from home during lockdown, you can't go back to where your nostalgia is. You can't find it because you can't leave your local area. What happens then if your local area that you grew up in doesn't exist? That place, that nostalgic place in your memory, rightly or wrongly, if your nostalgia is different from what it actually was, if that doesn't exist, how can you find that anchor? And what does that mean for the questions you have around your anxiety and fears, or just your identity, where you came from, and your legacy, I suppose, for what. And I was looking for that for myself, and in that notice, I noticed how it's changed, or how it might not exist for a lot of people. You know what I mean? And I think it was conscious in that list to document places that nobody else was documenting, that were kind of overlooked, taken for granted, apart from the people that stay there. And if you stay there, it's stuff that you maybe you do overlook, you know what I mean, consciously, until it's not there anymore. You know what I mean? So I did go out to document something different. I did go out to look for, searching for nostalgia, maybe that is there or wasn't there.
And I think, sorry, what were you saying, Sean?
No, that was it. That was it.
I know. I think it's interesting because what I found, what I took from it as well, was what was interesting, because there isn't people in the 40s. Me myself, because it was the sort of physical surroundings then that you sort of looked to, and as I say, the work I was doing in the scheme I live in, you did notice it was you were drawn to these sort of physical landmarks because the place was quiet, empty a lot of the time. So you were drawn to them, whether it was for nostalgia or just it was sometimes just the sort of surprise that actually there's nothing happening here. Like everywhere's shut. Everybody that works here is gone because none of them live here. Like they didn't live here, so they were all away, and we're just left here ourselves, and we need to try and figure all that out. And I thought that was quite interesting, and I suppose that does chime with that larger problem you're talking about the representation of working class people on the news or in culture generally, because a lot of times if there is something that's portrayed as being a positive story of working class people, it's normally, you know, Malcolm X talked about mascots, you know, like the state mascots. They say, oh, look at this guy. He's special talented because look how he escaped the ghetto type thing. And then they take all that and go, oh, man, it's because I'm special and I'm so gifted that I've escaped the ghetto. And then they go back into the scheme and tell everybody about it and how. So then people will internalize that and think, oh, what's wrong with me then? Do you know what I mean? I wish I could be as gifted as this person. No understanding it's all a total nonsense. These people are just being picked. You know what I mean? They're just encouraged and funded. And so there's these bigger problems that the journal does highlight, I think, about how we experience our own lives ourselves is very different from how it's represented. And I think the pandemic and the lockdown definitely intensified that feeling for people who felt that they were underrepresented.
Oh, absolutely. And that tokenism is exactly right. You know what I mean? And it's how you're drawn out. And I think how they've used the images through the pandemic, it was videos of politics, and again goes back to the politicians thing. So if this was documenting our life conditions and where we were and stuff like that, with politicians' quotes, the videos of the politicians when they're in doorstep clapping and stuff was visually quite telling as well. You know what I mean? And it told its own story. So that's kind of all you're seeing. You are seeing that if you're the only human interaction you're getting is through your TV, and everybody's living in a nice house and it seems comfortable and secure, and you don't feel comfortable, secure, and you're wondering, will I ever feel comfortable and secure? Will lockdown ever finished? How did I get myself in this position where I haven't, like you said, become one of these token few that's get out? You know what I mean? Is it because I've done something wrong in my life? What did I do wrong? And then your mind starts spiraling. You go away down a black hole thinking, what choices did I make in my life that meant I wasn't one of these people on the telly that could stand at my doorstep and clap in a bought house with a nice garden? You know what I mean? And that's a genuine thing, I think, acknowledging everybody does think that, you know what I mean? Different times, and it heightened that. So it's about how we do tell our own story, and not to shy away from the fact that people have aspirations of doing a bit better in their own area as well. And when you can't leave it, it almost becomes even the physical infrastructure of a lot of the pictures. So like the CCTV cameras I mentioned, I remember growing up on the space of a week, there's loads of I suppose alleyways and lanes between all the terraced housing, and 8-foot fences get put up. This was the same week I started high school, and 8-foot fences get put in high school, big magnetic doors. To walk from my high school back to where I stayed, I had to walk through an area of bought houses. And when the same sort of weeks, they get traffic camera measures, made it all cul-de-sacs. So it's a lived environment. And I think this came out in the pictures as well. So like we're marrying up these quotes where politicians are saying one thing, but we've got health centres which have these 8-foot fences around them with barbed wire in the middle of the scheme. Why has it got that? But why? What message does that send? You know what I mean? If we see that every day, it's that idea like when police officers wear riot uniforms. You know what I mean? Stuff like that. Like what message that's in there? Your first interaction when you wake up in the morning is big fences and barbed wire and places in decay or cold grey places. What? Everything makes you feel cold and isolated. You know what I mean? And it's you. I can never. I'm trying to think how best to explain it, but it's just it draws you into that feeling where like everything's defensive, so you become defensive. You know what I mean? Everything's a fortress, so if you want you need to attack. You know what I mean? And these are all subtle things that, admittedly, I could never articulate or understand until I started doing this. I still can't do it properly, but through taking the pictures and just looking at them again, you start to think, well, why are things designed like this in our communities? Why? Who's designing them like that? Yeah. And who's interested? You know, and then what impact and effect does that have? Because, like you said, the nice cul-de-sacs don't have 8-foot spiked fences at the end of every street. You know what I mean? Or CCTV cameras pointing in everybody's windows. And when we talk about being stuck inside and not having those wider support networks and fears and anxieties, well, you look outside your window and you're met with that every day. You're not going to want to go out and enjoy it, if there's sun or not, even the lack of sun in Scotland, you know what I mean? So it's just, it was documenting that, and it just, like you said, to capture it, I was drawn to it, and the more it came out throughout the process, is a kind of real haunting of working class communities and how these are things designed in a certain way and imposed on us, even though we fought for these things, where they fought in our vision, did they materialise in our vision, and then what's going to happen with them, you know what I mean? What's going to happen with us coming out of lockdown, and everybody spoke about the opportunity or the new social contract that will emerge, but the middle classes and everybody else is terrified coming out here. Finances and cuts and everything else. They're going to want security even more. You know what I mean? So it's not going to be any great big changes. So it's about how what changes do we want to make? How do we express that? I think is what I was trying to get across there as it comes out more and more.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. As you look at decisions of working class communities, most of the decisions about our communities are made somewhere else. And then these decisions then happen to us. Like we are not part of the decision making process in any serious and respected way. And I think part of the change, I'm older than you, of course, Sean, but the part of the change that I've noticed has been when I grew up in the housing scheme, the local councillor lived in the scheme. No, I mean, we're in the middle of an election now. I mean, you'll be lucky if any of the candidates come in the scheme I live, you know what I mean? And if we do, there'll be a Polish helicopter above, it'll be a photo up above. I mean, it's just, we live in a totally different world, like, and the political class, including the journalists and that, none of them live in these areas. So the areas you're photographing, none of the politicians will be living there. So what do we make of that, about that disconnect that's happened between the political class and traditional working class communities?
They probably just, well, there was a famous quote during the independence referendum, I vaguely remember, and it was, can't remember who said it, but I remember it plastered on leaflets of some kind, and it was, people with mattresses in their back gardens don't win elections or don't vote. And it's that disdain, and it's that feeling, well, what's the point, they're not going to vote anyway, rather than the idea of, well, what will make them vote? You know what I mean? Or why are they not voting, and exploring that question. It is, this is an election. If we want to be serious, credible, and we want to win, they're not going to vote, so there's no point. So we'll direct all our efforts to middle class swing voters. And that's the kind of crux of any election, I think, is the lesson that I've learned the hard way recently as well. So it's just like, that's the way the political class think. And so what's the point in actually spending a bit of time and doing work, because there's no guarantee I'm going to get something out of it for myself in the long run, is the best way I can answer that in a minute, you know what I mean? But the idea, or the point you made, sorry, around decisions not being made by us or for us and top of us is quite prevalent again. And go back to just this occupation, the Kalina Street land occupation. Big thing that came through that is that the local council said that they'd done a consultation 14 years ago, and that was okay then. Noted that the house has been flattened since that consultation, you know what I mean? The local community's been dispersed since then. The people that remain have now been asked what's been happening to this land, and they're doubling down on it, and it's a legal requirement to consult the area. So the community garden and everything we're doing up there is drawing a lot of people out, and we're having their own consultation process, etc. But even just being in the communities and try to change it, I suppose the weather. I went up yesterday for my shift on watch, and it was teeming with a young team, people, young kids, young people all out, getting stuck in, asking if they can grow it, and they would bring the parents out for the flats, and the same thing was coming through time and time again. Nobody's, the council never asked us. Of course they should ask us what goes on here. It's a basic fundamental thing that everybody agrees on. Well, we should have a voice, we should have a saying what's happening here. It's through that they want to do it, and then they're all want to get stuck in and market their own allotments and grow their own veg and that. Well, and they understood the basic principle of, well, if we do this, it means you need to talk to us. And it's mad that we need to do something like that for them to actually listen and think we need to actually give them a say in this. Yeah. It's almost like they're irritated by it, and we need to irritate them enough that they'll sit up and take notice. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's exactly what you got today. And so it's a positive collective action in the community which brings it to their attention. I mean, we've had exactly the same problems in areas at Edinburgh where consultations that the council do are just the farcical, like they're not serious attempts to consult people at all. And of course, the irony is, if we did consult people in the community, I mean, we who live in these communities understand what the problems are, and we understand a lot of the solutions as well. If they would just listen to us rather than speaking, they probably paid some company to do that consultation a fortune as well. It really is a farce. And is there information, where can people find out more about that occupation? Because that sounds like a nice positive story as well for people to tap into.
Aye, so it's called Still Game for the Valley, and it's actually the land where Still Game was filmed. So that's why it's called Still Game for the Valley. Double meaning the local community is still up for the area, which was colloquially known as the Valley. Osprey Heights in the background still stands, and it's Still Game for the Valley. It's on Facebook. I think the Twitter Save the Valley. Our Facebook page, we're putting a lot of videos for local people that are involved, different histories of the area. So I suppose one good wee anecdote was the area across the other side of the canal it's called the Butney. And someone asked, why is it called the Butney? And it was why the older members of the campaign, who's a fountain of local knowledge, came up and said, it's called Butney because that's where you stayed before you put in the canal boat and took away to Botany Bay. And they called the Butney over time. So like that was another area that get regenerated, people cleared, come back, private housing. So like the Facebook page, Still Game for the Valley, Twitter, Save the Valley, and a lot of good video content and a lot of support. And it's one of these things where it's captured the imagination, I think, a lot of people in the area, but wider. And it's also during lockdown, we're doing the garden, it's outdoor exercise. You're socially distant, but people are feeling that they need to come out and do something, or they've got the opportunity then, and people are really enjoying this, I suppose, the social aspect of it as well. It's well worth a wee like and a bit of support. And one of the ideas, I suppose, around that is that, and I'm sure Edinburgh's the same, is that all these areas of public land where housing was demolished and working class people were moved from the area, is one of the things I wanted to try to document as well, is that they've laid vacant the idea that they're going to bring private housing and bring some different class of people back in, and it's never materialised or how it's going to happen, is we want that occupation not to be the be all and end all, but to start a conversation about public land. Who owns it? What's to do with it? Who's got a say over it, and what can be done with it? And through that, hopefully snowball across urban areas in Scotland where we start fighting over our right to exist in cities, like, to put it really bluntly, at the core, working classes get a right. We built the cities, we've got a right to stay here and defend our land. So as much as one occupation, it's a good anybody can like it and use the ideas or to examine the local area. I suppose you can bring the two of the journal again. The idea of mapping your local area, who owns the land, why is it there, why is it empty, what can we do about it, and have that process snowball. Because I think housing and land is going to be a big political hot potato over the next year. It always is, but I think the same housing academic, Neil Gray, who kind of introduced me to the idea of a territorial neighbourhood inquiry, he spoke about when there's shocks to the economic system, investment looks inward. So like if you talk about Brexit or COVID or something, the money men, there's no international trade happening, or if there's any kind of potential, they fear it's going to happen, they look to put their money into secure investments. And it always seems to be in housing and land. And I think that's more and more, even although Edinburgh defeated the stock transfer stuff, I think Edinburgh City Council are going to reassess that soon across central Scotland if we still got council housing. Even though right to buy stopped, that's the largest public asset that they can remortgage, essentially. You know what I mean? They try to do it with PFI schools, but also just land. So like Glasgow, I took a walk in the city centre for the first time in a year, and they went to cranes that are up along the Brumelaw and the new Barclays Bank building, all Tradeston land that's laid vacant for as long as I can remember. Big fancy glass buildings. You know what I mean? So what's happening with this land and who's it for? I think we can. It's not a case of we're just predicting something that might not happen. If you look at examples elsewhere in the UK where the big inner cities have become crippled by finance and these developments, it's an opportunity to maybe plant a flag in the ground and really fight our corner here.
Absolutely, and we'll make sure we share all the links as well to the occupation, because that sounds like something people should follow and support. Certainly in Edinburgh, it's a big issue in terms of how public land is subtly shifted in its use and becomes private space. And the next step for that is it becomes, oh, well, it's no public land anyway, nobody uses it. So it's like it's then sold to developers, and it's a sort of subtle wee transition that happens, and it happens in middle of housing schemes with some of the playing parks and different green space roundabout housing schemes as well as obviously some of the land value in Edinburgh city centre. Some of the dodgy deals that are done there are like disgraceful. Like, so I think you're right. That is absolutely, housing and land is going to be a big issue for us moving forward. And that sort of takes me on just as we wrap up. What about, I mean, the figures at the back of the journal are stark in terms of, you break it down in terms of cases in the UK, cases in Europe, and then cases globally, cases and then deaths. And obviously it's like shocking. And we're now a year later and there's all these people being ill and died, and government failure at every level. I don't think it really matters. I don't support any political party, but I don't think it really matters what political party you support, to be perfectly honest. They've all been completely incompetent, like, and failed us at every single level. But as you mentioned, when we come out of COVID, there is going to be huge pressures in terms of paying for all the furlough and all the various other things that have to be paid for. So what do we make of that in terms of, for working class communities that you've been cataloguing this photojournal, what do we make of that in the sense of these are already communities that have been cut to the bone, like they're already services. The state is already in retreat in these communities. They're already taking a step back. That vacuum gets filled by the poverty industry, which, charities and businesses who the charities like to call themselves the third sector, which is meant to mean that they're independent of the state and business, but actually they're funded by the state and business. Like, I mean, that's who they work for. So what do we make of that, though, in terms of this is already a really bad situation for these working class communities, and it looks like it's going to get worse. We didn't have any political representation to speak of in terms of people who understand what our experience is like. So what's your thinking on that?
Where do we start? I think you're exactly right. I think we're nearing the end of a process that's been death by 1,000 cuts in a lot of ways. So the way they've drip fed, I suppose, first the industrialisation, the way they've drip fed the mitigations to that is to slow it down and spread it over a generation or two. And then when we thought they were climbing back out that, austerity again has been done in such a way that it's undermined public services or even statutory services run by councils, as simple as social work, your bins getting taken out, home care, they've been undermined continuously to the point where they couldn't deal with the COVID crisis. They couldn't. And that's where all of a sudden money was found to boost these frontline services at times where it was needed, particularly when the NHS as well. And as much as we would love to hope that it'd be a wake-up call, we all know the reality that's not going to happen. There's going to be a big pressure again. Public spending needs to go down for some. I don't know how they rationalise that in their own head. Basically, economics says you can't run a state economy the same as a household economy. So they're going to come back for all these things. But I suppose the impact it's going to have in areas that I've documented, the areas that we talk about, is that I do think it's the straw that just breaks the camel's back in a lot of ways, because there's nothing left to cut. There's one of the things coming out in the pictures, I think, is that there's an absence of actually any state infrastructure anyway. You know what I mean? There's an absence of any private sector infrastructures as well, right? But there's an absence of a real lack of absence. There's anything we know the whole story. Bookies, chemists, you know what I mean? Job centre, if you're lucky. If you're lucky, that is. I've took all them away as well. You know what I mean? So it's like there's an absence of that. So like there's nothing there for us to fight as well. So I mind watching the thing about Easterhouse in the 80s, and it was some academic was trying to explore why was there no riots in Easterhouse the same way there was in other UK cities for the 80s. And the local community said, what, there's riots every day. It's just because there was no private property, nobody cared. It never made the news. You know what I mean? Like these things happen. So like it's building the capacity. I think the time will come. We need to build the capacity ahead of steam for when that moment of conflict does happen, because to be able to assert ourselves, I mean, so build the capacity or structure and strength and experience of the working communities to campaign, which is always there. It's just it's never maybe connected. It seems disconnected at times with different generations. And the moment will come where I do have an inherent belief that we'll organically come together some way, somehow, and really take hold of the situation in our own interest. I think it will happen. And the reason I think it will happen is because there's nowhere else to cut. There's nowhere else to run. So local authorities, through my own work, engagement with them, their big idea is to remortgage the PFI schools to finance and run the statutory frontline services. That's not going to wash. They can't keep doing that. Payments will just go up. They're going to get fun out. They'll go bankrupt. The other idea, like I said, is that they'll try and leverage finance against any buildings they've got, including council housing stock. That's whether every politician can deny that to my face right now, but I guarantee in 5 to 10 years' time, if there's no change, that's going to be top of their agenda. It's the only place they've got to go. If there's no place they've got to go, then these services are going to really start to, you're going to see the difference. You know what I mean? So during lockdown, I don't know what it's like being like in Edinburgh, but during lockdown, when bulk uplift got turned off, the dump got closed because of COVID, the rubbish started to pile on the streets, and everybody went off their head. Everybody was going mad. What's happening here? We couldn't get child services were impacted, caring services were impacted. Never mind social security, such as universal credit and house benefits to keep the roof over your head stuff. To cut these anymore, these things start to go very quickly, and that snowballs very quickly, and that will bring to the fore the one thing they've managed to avoid through this slow death or using the third sector to mitigate the worst austerity, to cover the cracks. That all goes, and you're exposed with that class conflict, which will come to the front. And as soon as that happens, people see that experience and they went through the situation, the period that we've all went through. I reckon that there's no other way in my mind that goes. There's going to be conflict, and it's going to cause us that come out and talk one way or another because of the experience are going. So, what was your question again?
No, I think that is interesting, just in terms of looking, try to predict how this is going to play out socially, because there clearly is going to be conflict and there is going to be political judgments that have to be made, and they didn't get made in favour of the working class. That's the reality of it. Tell me as well, though, in sense of just all the things that you're highlighting, the failure to deal with COVID properly, competently, the stuff with care homes, all the stuff we're talking about with cuts in working class communities, who's going to pay for it, how we're going to build back and all this stuff. This should be the big issue in the middle. We're in the middle of an election in Scotland, and that should be what the argument is about. that doesn't get a look in it. It's just all about a sort of psychodrama between the SNP and Sturgeon and Salmond and what have you. But what I've found quite interesting as well is that it's not just is that the sort of debate about this sort of fallout between these people, but the working class have been mentioned a wee bit already in this election, but in a really disparaging way. Like anytime there's any sort of racist comment, it's like, oh my God, it's because that faction's fully working class people and that's how they speak. Or any tiny bad behaviour, the working class, it's like, oh, it's because all these people aren't as intelligent and all their candidates are bad because they come from schemes, or other members that they've got are bad because they come from. I mean, it's a really sort of weird thing, and that the media just seem to be perpetuating this. But again, that to me, that's just stoking conflict as well. Like it's stoking resentment. People are sitting looking at this and thinking, these people, these talking heads on the TV who are responsible for all of this, they don't care about us. They're not listening to us. In fact, they want to blame us.
Aye. As soon as it comes up, it's the working classes, folks. It's the only time you get a mention. And like I said, I think they're going to tie themselves. The political class are so absorbed by their own soap opera that there's nowhere left for them to turn in terms of the economic situation. But even the stuff you're mentioning, social conditions or attitudes, there's no one else left to blame. They've tried every trick in the book. They've turned everything against each other time and time again, but nobody believes their bullshit anymore. You know what I mean? And sees right through it. So they'll tie themselves up in so many knots. And I think this election, you'll see that. You'll see certain sensitivities tying themselves in knots to bend over backwards and be disparaging the people, that it'll come back and bite them big time. I do think that a political class will survive this election, but I don't see it maintaining for a long time unless something way out my mental capacity happens, something I can't foresee. I think there's, like you said, the conflict's been bubbling for so long, it's manifested itself to the right a few times, and you could say it's manifested itself to the left with maybe independence and Corbyn, and it's where it goes next. You know what I mean? And it's not a case it's definitely going to fall left wing, but that conflict will happen, and it'll be an opportunity at some point. Is the working classes, left wing working class people, to really grasp hold of the situation. So, as much as it is easy to be totally overwhelmed and overburdened by how bad everything is, I don't know if it's because of the sun, but I do have this kind of in there feeling that our chance will come and we'll be able to seize the day at some point.
Well, Sean, I think you're right. And I'll tell you what, your lockdown journal is fantastic, and it's exactly the type of creative working class response that we need, not just to lockdown, but to life and the struggles that we face in general. I think that's the type of positivity we're looking for. Where can people find the lockdown, most importantly? They find you?
Aye, so just Twitter and Instagram's probably the best. So I think Twitter's just Sean Baillie 9, and then on Instagram, Sean Baillie with underscores between my name. If you're not on either, it's on a Big Cartel website, so it's just lockdown.bigcartel.com. You'll be able to find it on there.
Excellent. We'll put all the links up as well on the All Hail to the Pod social media as well. Sean, fantastic talking to you. Good luck with the other lockdown journals as they get released. I'm sure everybody will love them. They're excellent. I encourage everyone to get one. Sean, catch you later on.
Thanks very much, Jim. Thanks for having me.